Hi everyone, I'm Anamitra, one of the co-founders of A4 Capital and host of the Pre-Seed Show. This is our first show for 2025, and I'm super excited to host Tony. He's the CEO and co-founder of Inngest. Inngest is a really fascinating company. They're building the infrastructure behind a lot of AI apps. Their customers include amazing AI companies like 11x, also traditional companies like SoundCloud and TripAdvisor. They're everywhere. They've also raised more than $10 million from notable investors like Andreessen Horowitz and Notable Capital. They used to be known as GGV before. We led the pre-seed round way back. What's really interesting about Tony is that he's gone through a founder breakup and a founder makeup. And he's lived to tell the tale. So I'm super excited to talk to Tony about what it's been like to get to product market fit, to raise a lot of money, and to become the infrastructure layer for a lot of AI apps. So without further ado, let's welcome Tony. Hey Tony, welcome to the Pre-Seed Show. Thanks for doing this. Inngest, as we heard in the intro, was an amazing company, the infrastructure layer behind a lot of AI startups, but not just AI startups. Major companies like SoundCloud and TripAdvisor also use it. So I'd like to hear from you about what, in your mind, is Inngest and why is it relevant to all AI applications?
Yeah, for sure. So Inngest is essentially durable execution. And you can think of durable execution as next generation orchestration or queuing. Step functions, essentially, written in code. And so when you're building a product or an application, you might have to do a sequence of operations, one step after another. You might want tracing, retries, observability behind them, and obviously like linking state. So one AI call might flow into another. That sort of stuff is typically pretty hard, especially if you have things like rate limits or concurrency controls. And you need to use a whole bunch of systems like queues, events, and whatnot to tie things together. We give you a platform that lets you do all of this with a couple lines of code, no new infrastructure, completely serverless, and your code deploys to wherever you currently deploy it. It kind of works anywhere. So extremely easy to set up. What would take a couple weeks takes like a minute or two, and people can start building their applications extremely easily.
That's amazing. Give us a sense of the scale of Inngest in terms of maybe, I don't know, number of devs, number of calls, number of processes to run, or customers you have. Just how big is it?
Yeah, so it's an interesting company because different ways to look at it, right? Like we're a fairly small team actually. I think just 14 people, but we do a lot. So we do billions of things a day. Our API calls, are in the tens to hundreds of thousands concurrently a second. And if you take a look at our stores and the databases behind them, we're doing millions of transactions per second. And people run an insane amount of stuff through us. You've got your AI stuff, which is anywhere from low to super high volume. And you've got your B2B stuff, the regular flows like payment flows, which can be spiky. And then you've got your B2C flows. We power a Chinese game, for example. And that is consistently high volume traffic. So as a company, customers, we've got, hundreds to thousands, I think like 10,000 people using this. And the volume is pretty insane for the team size of what we do. Making all that work reliably, which is the name of the game, really, if you're doing durable execution, is certainly a challenge.
That's right. And you power companies like TripAdvisor and SoundCloud. I mean, I'm just imagining SoundCloud music streams, so many millions of users on platforms like that, or so many millions of users on buying tickets on TripAdvisor. Yeah,
exactly. And so when you're powering these sort of core flows, and people depend on you to run their application, the stakes get higher. So it's definitely an interesting company to work at. Super interesting technical challenges. And a really, really broad set of use cases. Like SoundCloud, they started with doing a whole bunch of like fraud and Spotify wrapped stuff with us. And then they moved their entire set of microservices that does music distribution to us because they realized how easy it was to develop once they adopted us. And music distribution is such a critical thing for SoundCloud, being a music company. So yeah, it's particularly important to make sure that we do a really good job. And then you've got honestly, sometimes more personally important things to people. Like we do a bunch of health insurance stuff, and making sure that you do that correctly, reliably, in a fast way is really important. So we focus a lot on engineering principles and making sure the product is as good as possible. And this year, bunch of changes coming, which are going to make that really, really, really interesting as well. So a lot of bare metal stuff, our own networking going out, global edge network. So it's fun. A lot to do with just a small team.
Yeah, it's amazing that you're doing all of this with 14 people. One trend that seems to be pretty clear is that there's now a movement around using more AI more and more to code apps. You don't need as many developers, maybe any junior level developers to write code. What you're doing is also very similar to that, where you don't need someone on the back end or orchestrating, queuing, managing those things, and that can all be done by software, by Inngest, right?
Yeah, basically. And that's super interesting. We've had a bunch of teams in which, previously it would take months to learn how to use Kafka, set up new services, do the whole pub sub stuff, figure out how to deploy. And it would take a specific set of engineers on the back end to figure that out. And when they adopt Inngest, turns out any engineer can start writing code because it's just like step.run. And they deploy to wherever, it could literally be Vercel, it could be Netlify, it could be Lambda. You don't need to do any magic to make it work. And so it sort of widens the market so that anybody can build complex apps. Anybody can build these sorts of really, really difficult workflows, which is firstly great because it shouldn't be that difficult. I don't know why it's been that difficult for such a long time, for years. And secondly, it's really good for companies because with AI in particular, I think like a few things has happened. Like the stakes have been raised such that, people are building more and more, faster and faster. So you need to build better products faster. Anything that lets you do that is really, really great. And secondly, I think people's expectations have sort of raised as well. So if you're spending 4 or 5 weeks to develop a pipeline, a workflow, when it could be done in an hour or two, I think it's definitely a disadvantage just to, you as a product, and delivering faster is so important.
That's great. Wonderful. Now, from your accent, my guess is you didn't grow up in San Francisco with listening to a lot of BBC. You grew up elsewhere. Tell me a little bit about where you started, where you were born, how did you get your start in tech, and ultimately how did you get to San Francisco?
I was, I guess, quite lucky in that I remember the day we got our first computer. I was maybe 6, and they were amazing. I was like, oh my god, this is great. Back in the 90s, not super early, but still not super late. And I taught myself how to program when I was a kid because if ever there was an issue, I would be the only one to fix things. And I was like, oh man, computers are cool. So I downloaded a bunch of stuff for C++. I think there was this compiler called Bloodshed back in the day, if I remember rightly. I taught myself C++ and Java and PHP, whatnot in the 90s, going into 2000s. The classic stuff of just wanted to learn how things work, make games. And then pretty easy to go from there into tech. Because 2000s, Facebook was a thing, Google was a thing. Lots of people were trying to do e-commerce because I don't think Shopify was even around then. So people were all trying to do it themselves with Magento and helping out a lot with that. I ended up working with a record label in London to build an early version of literally Spotify in a web browser in 2009. And I had this book called High Performance JavaScript Applications. Code was an absolute mess, but was doing a lot back in the day. So pretty easy to transition into tech. And then I started working in this company called Conductor, a whole bunch of SERP, SEO stuff. Wasn't the prettiest business, but lots of high volume stuff, again, Java. And then from there ended up working, Docker came out. Docker was fantastic. French company, moved to SF, and I loved Docker so much. We were using Vagrant. And I loved Docker so much. I was like, this is incredible. It's going to change the way that we build code. It would be awesome to work there. So knew somebody from Docker, interviewed, and then when I got the Docker job, I moved to SF, which is back in 2015. And I think especially in that time frame, if you were interested in tech and you were programming, and you were an engineer, the chances are you would probably end up in SF because all the good companies were here. There were like a few in New York and a few in London. I remember the Guilt Group had a bunch of really, really interesting meetups in New York. There was a Hacker News meetup in London, which doesn't exist anymore for some reason. So there were things going on, but most of the companies, it was like YC's heyday, which is another topic. But they were all here, and so I think like naturally you just sort of found your way here, and companies would ask you to move because it wasn't RTO, it was just office. Like that's what you had to do. So yeah, it was good. Lucky, I think, actually. Like there was honestly like a fair amount of luck involved, and serendipity of meeting people at Docker at the right time. Before it was huge. Yeah, so a little bit of everything, I suppose.
That's great. So it's like a serendipitous journey, and then to me it feels like some of the same energies back in San Francisco, especially after COVID. With AI, maybe that's probably the driver. Folks seem to be back. And after Docker, you went to worked at a healthcare company, which is where you learned maybe a lot of the application stuff. And then you and your former co-founder Tina started the company. Just talk a little bit about how you decided to start something. How you decided to work with your co-founder at the time. Yeah,
so I mentioned how if you adopt Inngest, when engineers adopt Inngest, what would take months would take like a day. We were in the same situation back in this company called Uniform Teeth, which got bought out by a company called Impress, orthodontic company, healthcare, event-driven, because events are really good audit trails. We had to build some pretty complex systems to deal with events, patients, treatments, prescriptions, that sort of stuff. And it was really challenging, really, really challenging. It took us a long time, a lot of services. The code was, again, not that great. And the developer tooling behind the code, the infrastructure was okay, but the developer tooling was terrible. And our engineering slowed to a crawl, which is stuff that we hear from people that are just adopting Ingests all the time. Like Mothership.com are literally in the same place right now, and they're adopting us, and they've said the same thing. 40 services using Kafka, features take months. And in my head, I was like, similar to like the whole React thing. React is declarative. You get a component, and it's super nice because you can pass down props, and it re-renders and state and such. In my head, I was like, why is there so much ceremony around events? Why do we have to create events, create all these topics, subscriptions, create stateful subscribers, and then chain together all of these separate things? Why can't we just do something declaratively that ties together events and queues and allows you to manage state automatically? So you say step.run, step.run, and then critically step.wait for event, which pauses your functions until a matching event is received or times out. So I started not by thinking about the technology, but the applications of the API and how it would save engineers time, what the outcomes would be, which were wrong to begin with, which is another part of it. It took a long time to narrow down on the right API to make it intuitive. But thinking about what the outcomes would be if the technology and the APIs were right to solve all of our problems, and then spoke to another bunch of engineers and engineering leaders to honestly verify that they had the same problem. And it turns out like literally everyone did. Because if you were trying to do something in this way, there was nothing that was off the shelf that would allow you to do it. And then that's where we wanted to start the company, based off of events, running applications, running functions, that sort of stuff. Super different to begin with. We've changed a lot, which we'll talk about in terms of learnings. But that's the reason why. Just genuinely feeling the pain. Yeah.
That's great. And then sort of shifting gears a little bit, talking about co-founders. You and Tina were working at Uniform Teeth at the time. Yeah. And you decided to start the company together. Eventually, the relationship didn't work out, and you parted ways amicably. Just talk us through that experience a little bit about starting and then realizing maybe your paths are a little different.
Yeah, totally. So we worked together for a couple of years. And Tina is a fantastic product engineer. And in my mind, I was thinking like, well, we've got this backend infrastructure that we need to build that I'm good at and I can do. And the product side of things is going to take a lot to develop as well. In my head, I was like, we got on well. She's a great product engineer. That would be a good partnership, because I was thinking we need people who don't necessarily have overlapping skills. You don't want two people that are the same circle on a Venn diagram when you're starting a company, ideally, because, find somebody that complements you. So I asked her about it, told her I was going to start the company based off of the idea, and walk through things and the verification and the validation that I'd done. And we kind of hit the ground running for a few months before things started to get difficult. And here's, everyone says this when you start a company. Everyone's like, this is a lot harder than you expect, so brace yourself. And everyone that starts a company is like, it can't be that hard. This is super easy. Don't worry about it. And it turns out it's as hard as they say it is. Things aren't necessarily all great. You get really, really, really good interest. And then when you're super early on, it could be hard to convert that interest into a trial customer or into a pilot. Because, again, super early. And so you have to be able to accept the fact that you're going to get a lot of no's, and accept the fact that it's going to be a really, really, really long and difficult journey. And I think I had started to accept that. And sometimes that can be particularly difficult to accept, which I think is a challenge. And so knowing that, you're in it for the long haul, 10, maybe more than 10 years, you've got a lot to focus on, and you're going to get a lot of super great highs and super low lows. Knowing that, I think you really need to figure out, do you want to commit to this full time? And I don't know how common it is to not want to commit once you've realized that early on, but I think it's a thing. And I think one of the learnings that I had is figuring out the motivation behind starting a company is particularly important when you're thinking about being a founder or finding a co-founder. And I didn't think hard enough about the motivation, because there's some I don't know the right word, prestige behind being a founder, which might be misplaced, to be honest. It's good, but it's definitely challenging, and it's hard. And if you want to start a company because it sounds great, and you like the idea, that's part of it. But you need some sort of genuine, irrational worldview where you're going to push through no matter what. Oh, I'll say that again. Sorry. You need some sort of irrational worldview in which you're going to push through no matter what, because you're going to get told no a lot of times. I think figuring that out is something that I didn't have. I just thought about the overlapping skill sets and not necessarily, do we want to commit? What's the motivation behind starting a company, and are we okay to do this in the long haul? Which was definitely a learning that I think is super important.
Right. So it sounds like you were being practical at the time. You were trying to figure out, okay, this is the way the world will be. This is what I can do. This is what my co-founder can do. We should join forces and start, because that's what would happen. And then I guess what you understood through that process is that having the same motivation is correct. It's really important. And the red flag you mentioned, I think, sounds like no founder should be starting this for the sake of prestige, for clout or anything like that. You should just assume it's not going to work, and you're still going to grind through. That sounds about right. How did you come? I guess you came to the realization that the two of you were thinking about things differently.
Yeah. And
many founders, I find, even at that stage, they find that they're just joined. There's nothing that they can do, and it's and if you find a customer, if you get fundraising done, then it's good enough. Versus you took a different approach. You two took a different approach, right? That decided to it's not if it's not working, it's not working. Let's separate.
Yeah. And there's so much to unpack here, I ended up going to therapy for quite a long time about it to figure out the reasoning behind it and whether or not we'd made the right call. I think you raised something really interesting, which is if you find some customers and you find traction, things will be okay. And that's true, but and it's similar just in personal relationships as well. Inevitably, there's going to be something else that crops up, which is going to be difficult. Companies have setbacks all the time. Companies have issues that you can avoid by thinking about them and setting some mitigations in place, but it's never 100% right. And so you have to really think like, okay, cool. If we did succeed in the next month and we picked it back up, is this pattern going to play itself out again?
Right.
Do we actually succeed as honestly like a pair in a true relationship, because it's genuinely a true relationship? And I think we had both realized that the journey was so long. There was so much work to do, and there would be these highs and lows, that it was it's still really difficult, but the right thing to do to split, which is really hard. It's really hard. And again, I think like the motivation is particularly important. We didn't split because there was differences in what the product should do. We didn't split because of some like honestly silly argument. It was specifically, is this going to be something that we can do for 10 years? Are we willing to genuinely focus and grind at this? There have been days where you do like 18, 24, 32 hours, especially if there are incidents. I remember doing 4 or 5 weeks of just 18 hours straight to try and get to where we needed to be in 1 month. And are you genuinely willing to do that for years? And I think like pulling the plug is a really difficult thing to do. She was a friend, and we don't speak too much now, which is sad, because I like her as a person. But ultimately, you kind of make a commitment to the people around you as well, to the company, to the people that have trusted you. And if it's true and it's the right thing to do, you should probably do it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a really tough, obviously personally, but also from a company perspective. It took some time to recover, and then, but eventually, looking back on that now, you then sort of found Dan from Buffer, who's been amazing for the company, and then you kind of worked your way through product market fit, finding customers, really listening to developers, building a developer experience that is stellar. And then fundraising, and now it's sort of scaling and supporting a lot of companies and services. What was that process about? Sort of iteration on the product, like getting your first trial, converting a trial to a contract, and what was that process like?
Yeah. I'll start by contextualizing the changes that have made, because if you go on Inngest.com now, you will see a very different product to how it was when we were going through this. So again, Inngest.com, next gen orchestration, step.run. It runs your functions automatically, and it's code based. You deploy to your existing setup, and we invoke the code where it lives. Previously, actually, we ran the code for you, and it was Docker based because I used to work at Docker. It was also sort of DAG based. You would have to build this graph, which was really, really, really difficult to use. And so I'll just explain some of the iterations when Dan joined, the things that we learned. And it's summarized by I think the biggest thing that we learned is time to value and friction, which everyone talks about all the time, but you really need to internalize. Time to value is literally just how fast do people get to the end experience where they learn what your product does for them. How fast can they use and understand your product? And if you shorten time to value to the point where it's so easy, it takes minutes, then people are going to understand and either opt in or opt out to your product really quickly. If it takes an hour of setup or a day of setup for them to get started, people aren't going to complete it, and they're going to opt out, and you have 0 customers, even if it's a particularly difficult problem like the one that we're solving. So for us, I think we had this approach, and we were trying to make this approach easier, this DAG-based workflow approach. But fundamentally, it was wrong because it was still too hard to consume, to specify up front. People just want to write regular code. And so one of our early users actually completely bypassed all of our system, wrote some code, deployed it to Vercel, and then used our system to call his code on Vercel. And we were like, that is a genius idea. Why didn't we think of this to begin with? We chatted to him, and we were like, we're going to throw everything that we've done out, API-wise. The core systems didn't change, infrastructure, events, all that sort of stuff, but throw out the entire way you use Inngest, and then rebuild it from scratch. We did that in 4 days. I remember speaking to Jack, one of our first engineer, speaking to Jack, and we came up with the SDK, the APIs, the plans in literally a day, built it in 4 days, got it out by Friday, between Monday to Friday, sent it to the early users who were struggling with what we built. And they were like, this is incredible. This is amazing. Please let me use this for the foreseeable future. And in that, we realized, time to value, but also like the wedge. This person was doing something with Vercel, and Vercel didn't have any queuing, didn't have the ability to run step functions. It didn't have any state, and you certainly couldn't use it as a Kafka subscriber. So we realized, like, if we use serverless as a wedge, we can, number one, broaden the adoption of dribble execution. Number two, attack a market that is super unmet. No one's doing this, which is great, because then we can grow with that set of users. And then from there, we can widen the adoption to, Kubernetes, bare metal, the stuff that we do now. So I think, like, iterating specifically on how people use you and the value was the most important part. And I think, like, looking back, it's so obvious. And it's really similar to the situation with the co-founder, actually, in which it's uncomfortable to pull the plug on your current stuff. It's uncomfortable to pull the plug on a co-founder. It's uncomfortable to pull the plug on your product that you've worked for months on, and you started the company with this idea. But if it's true that changing things will make it easier, you should probably do it, even if it's challenging. And I wish we'd have probably done that just 2 or 3 months sooner. And we didn't actually, I think in hindsight, accept that fact soon enough.
Right. So that's a fascinating tale. So it sounds like a developer customer kind of pointed you to the way of what should be. It was a gift. But what was interesting about all of that is the purist in you saw that and questioned what you already had, and weren't too worried about pulling the plug, just like you did organizationally. So is that a common theme that you find in yourself, in your sort of learning and growth as a founder, which is like no sacred cows, long term oriented, and whatever is right for the end user, for the developer.
Yeah. It's now actually one of our company values, which is, like, honestly, if it's true, you shouldn't be afraid of it, even if it means throwing out a bunch of stuff you've already done. If it's right, you should do it, because I don't think that you can find success by avoiding the truth, to be honest. If the world changes with AI as it is, avoiding AI isn't necessarily in your best interests. Not to say that AI is used everywhere, but if you're in a market that's going to completely change because of AI, avoiding it is not great, and avoiding the truth it leads you down a bad path. So definitely one of our core values now. And I remember this book called Principles by Ray Dalio that I read when I was maybe 16. I think it was a PDF from Berkshire Hathaway before it was a book. And it was distributed on the internet. People were talking about it when it came out. And it has a really similar principle about truth. And I thought about that with the learnings of the company, and I was like, this makes a lot of sense. Right. So we've stuck to that, and it's hard because everyone gets attached to the stuff that they've done. Especially if you're building a company, you have this emotional connection and link to it. It's a representation of you and your team. And so it's definitely hard to willingly throw that out at the drop of a hat. Sometimes on assumptions, because the evidence is, maybe anecdotal in a way. But you need to be able to be willing to test your assumptions and question everything, because there's, so much that we don't know when we start a company. It's tough, but the right thing to do. And I think also freeing in the company.
That's right. The other thing that comes across from what you're describing is the speed at which you iterate, the speed at which the company iterates and moves to respond to developers' needs, partly because you're in the critical path. Inngest is in the critical path of many critical functions that customers kind of rely you on and developers kind of rely upon you. So the developer experience also comes across in what people say about Inngest on Twitter. It's very, very positive. How do you think about developer experience? How do you sort of like differentiate yourself relative to maybe the competition about with developer experience? Because the bar for developers is extremely high, right? Then they'll try you and drop you if it doesn't work instantly. So you gotta meet that threshold. How do you achieve that threshold?
Yeah, so the developer bar is really high. Infrastructure is really hard. All those caveats apply, and building an infrastructure company is genuinely challenging. I think for us, we think a lot about time to value. So once we've built the SDK early on in that week, we were like, well, great, you can deploy this, but how do you test it? And the only answer is local testing. You can talk about like shift right, shift left. If you really want to be able to experiment with a new product, do not want to deploy that to production to actually see if it works. Like legitimately not going to happen. So we thought a lot about like, what's the path that users are going to take? How are they going to understand and learn our product? What would be the easiest way for them to adopt us and learn how to build things? Which means local dev server with a UI that you can use to explore your functions, tracing and such. All of that stuff is particularly important. And then as people adopt you, thinking about the use cases, just talking to users all the time, seeing what they need to do, and then thinking like, have we met that need? Is there an easier way to do this? If somebody were to literally take our company and copy it, which happens a surprising amount, and they change something, would that be better? And we realized like often, yes, it would. And if people copied our API, which has now happened like, 10, 15 times, would certain things make the experience better? And so we should do that. We should implement that, and we should change what we've done to, again, like drop the bad stuff and listen to what's true. And so thinking about that a lot was particularly important. Ultimately, like one of the principles of the company and the reason that we started it is we just want to make it easy for people to build good stuff. Right. We want to make it easy for people to be able to build complex stuff, because this stuff that we solve is genuinely hard, and making that easy is the most important thing for us. So we think about that a lot, to the point where we've got some really complex services, and we've got some really crazy things that we do. Like step.wait for event matching is hard. If you have 1,000 functions waiting for an order event, chances are you're going to receive 1,000 order events. And so you have to match 1,000 times 1,000 things, which is then matching millions in real time, quadratic. And you do that across hundreds of thousands or millions of events per second. You're talking like trillions of matches in real time. Genuinely hard. And so we've got a bunch of stuff that simplifies that into linear. But that's something that no other company does, because it's too hard. And it means that our engineers and our team, who are amazing, end up building really, really, really difficult, complex systems that make it really, really great to use. And we've never really once said, this is going to be too hard to build, because if it makes the user experience better, we should find a way to do it.
That's right. I mean, that goes to the core concept about commitment to the users, commitment to customers. One of the interesting things is when you got started, AI wasn't the way it is right now. And I'm guessing with it's so much easier now for developers to launch an AI application, but not as easy to maintain and sustain it and grow it in production. There's been because everybody wants to launch the application, massive amounts of usage, and then what happens behind the scenes is someone else's problem. Many people don't want to deal with it. How have you seen AI amplify what you're doing and change perhaps what Inngest is building?
Yeah, it is so interesting. AI is crazy. First off, in a really, really, really positive way. I don't mean that in a bad way at all. It lets people build a lot of things a lot faster. And it's really good at taking a bunch of unstructured data and moving it into structured data for programming. So for example, you get a bunch of emails, super unstructured. You want to find the content or the subjects, super great. You can do a lot with it. And annoyingly, being non-deterministic, you end up iterating on that a ton. And if you're doing flows in which one LLM call goes into another LLM call, which is also really common, it becomes really challenging, and you end up changing a bunch of your workflows over and over and over again, basically multiple times a day. I was just talking to one of our customers who does this for a CRM. They absorb all of your emails, all of your meetings, all of your scheduling, the meeting notes that they do transcription. Day.ai, they're great. And they've got these really, really complex workflows that flow from one to another, but it's all deterministic code that uses non-deterministic LLMs to get outputs that flow from one to another. And they iterate a lot. So firstly, the ability for you to continue to change your application code without having to redo your infrastructure and architecture is really important, which is why step.run, it turns out, is a really, really, really good API for building these sorts of AI applications. You don't need to redo your architecture. You don't need to provision new queues. You don't need to worry about concurrency. It just works. Right. So being able to re-architect things is particularly important, and being able to understand, observe everything is particularly important. So we give you tracing out of the box. People tie that tracing to LLM observability and evals elsewhere. And then you get observability in production, plus the evals from another company. And then you can iterate both on the prompts and your workflow code at once, which is great. Yeah. That's great.
And then sort of if you were to sort of look a little bit longer term, when you do dream about how big Inngest could be, where does your head go? What could Inngest become?
Yeah, so we did start off purposefully in the events and function space, and we made a really interesting call on like other systems, especially queuing systems, to not be RPC. As in, I don't just want to run this function and let me hit a Lambda to run this function. It was send an event and the event will run a function, or maybe more than one. And that's super important because you get a bunch with that. You can replay events if your function fails. And that's great because you don't have this annoying dead letter queue that you get with SQS. You don't have to rewind pointers like you do with Kafka. The experience is a lot better. But interestingly, because you get all of the event data from people's systems, you can do a ton with that. And that's super valuable, not as a company. We don't actually look at your data. We care about end-to-end encryption, for example. That's super easy to add. But you can do a lot with that as a platform. Like if you wanted to do real-time ETL, if you wanted to do other things like BI on that, you can send that over to Snowflake. There's a lot that you can do, basically being aware of the events at the application layer. And so purposefully deliberate about how we chose to position ourselves and the level of abstraction that we had. So honestly, immediate plan, short term, is just continue to be the best dribble execution company in API. Continue to progress that so that anyone can adopt this. Right. It was a thing before us with like a couple years work, but it was really hard to adopt. And our APIs make it super easy to adopt by anybody. Go to the market, let everyone build in this particular way, especially with AI, and then allow people to build with their events easily. So it could be anything from APIs over events to audit trails to BI to ETL. There's a bunch that you can do, and you don't need to change any of our architecture. It's just built in. So there's a lot of optionality, which is really important. We haven't touched on that, but another principle that we have is build for optionality. Don't put yourself into a corner. If you've got multiple different ways of doing something, choose the one that gives you the most flexibility so that you can learn more in the future, because you might be wrong. And our company is basically set up to do that due to our sort of level of abstraction, as it were.
Right. And then picking up on the topic of optionality is the incredible job you've done company building and fundraising specifically. You have great optionality and in terms of the investors you have, Notable Capital, notably, and also Andreessen Horowitz, two amazing groups, and A4 Capital, of course. Yeah,
of course.
Of course. So how do you think about fundraising, and what advice would you give to another founder, perhaps, who's also considering fundraising, early stage, seed, Series A? What is important? How do you run the process? How do you pick a lead, because you had options?
Yeah. So I'll take it from the very beginning of actually thinking about the fundraise prior to the actual options and doing the process. When we think about the fundraise, we think about where we need to be next, and where that needs to get you company objective and milestone wise. So for example, next fundraise, we'll have a set of objectives in the company of where we want to be in 2 years' time, 3 years' time. And how does that help you get there? What team do you need to hit those objectives, to hit those metrics, to do what you need to do? What do you need to staff at? Do you need to do anything else externally? Are you going to be doing marketing, sales, that sort of stuff? What other things in the budget are there? To be able to walk it back to say, okay, cool. Broadly, this is the minimum that we need to raise. This would be ideal, and so on. So that was helpful, and we do that a lot. And then focusing specifically on the product in the interim is great, because early on, when we spoke to Andreessen about this, and notable, Dan's great, Yoko's great, and Glenn obviously a notable great as well, as is Martina Andreessen. They all cared about the founders, the potential for PMF, the optionality. I remember speaking to Jason Warner from GitHub, poolside now, and he was like, this is the easiest company to monetize, and it has so many options for you to build in the future. This is great. So focusing on the product area, optionality, making sure that you get good early traction is all super important, because your seed investors aren't necessarily going to be asking what's your burn multiple, what's your margin. They're going to be wondering, is this a particular product? Does it meet a problem? Is this problem widespread? Why do people adopt you? And what's the reason for adopting? Is extremely important, because if you haven't thought through distribution and the reason that people are adopting you, you don't know if that's a slow ramp or if that's a fast ramp, or if that's a ramp that's going to stop at some point in a year's time. And so distribution is incredibly important. And one thing that I wish we'd focused on sooner as well. Figuring out those stuff and sort of creating a story around the future of the company becomes like really important. And then honestly, like, yeah, you should be networking with investors routinely, and just saying hi so that people are aware of what you're doing. Not excessively, because you've got a company to run and a product to build and customers to talk to and things to plan. But that was helpful because people were aware of what we were doing, the space. They had time to absorb the area in which we're working, what it meant, and think about it to create their own thesis on what we were doing. And that led to term sheets relatively easily, again, which means we're particularly lucky. But I think doing that made it better, because we weren't going in cold, as it were, saying, hey, here's this market that is just starting and we're going to be the best at it. Trust us. We had already told them what we're doing and why it's important. They already had time to speak to customers or talk to people about the particular area in which we're working to figure out, okay, this is a real problem. And then by the time we actually were ready to raise, the thesis was already there, and we didn't have to explain that entire process to them, which if you have to tell somebody why your company is important as you're raising, it's incredibly hard to do all of that in a half an hour or an hour. Yeah.
That's right. So you stayed in touch with investors, kept them posted, so they already knew, they understood what you're doing, and then you kind of you ran the process eventually, as opposed to starting cold turkey and asking for 100 posts.
Exactly.
It's a different take.
Yeah, exactly.
As we come to the end of this, I do want to ask you about advice you would give engineers, founders who are looking to build an AI. What advice would you give to founders who are starting off today?
Yeah. I realized that throughout this episode, we focused on the product, we focused on the APIs and time to value, and I didn't talk about distribution enough. Legitimately, it's easier than ever to build the skin of a product. And so the barrier to entry has dropped. You still need to be really high quality, but it's easy to build a product. It's hard to build distribution. And I think one of the challenges is, if you build a product, how do people know about it? How do people understand it? How are you going to distribute your product? And if you can understand that aspect, and honestly, game that aspect really well, then if you have two competing products that are doing the same thing, the one with bigger distribution is going to win. And so my main advice that I wish I could go back a year, 2 years and talk to myself about would be, think about distribution from day one. Because the product, the technology is all fun. It's great, super interesting to build, but it doesn't matter if people don't know about it. That would be the single biggest thing. And obviously, like, product is really important. People aren't going to use a bad product, but distribution is key. And that could be anything from partners. It could be anything from your network. It could be marketing. It could be videos, YouTube, Twitter. Maybe you built up a network already, but distributing early is is really hard. Going from that 0 to 1, as everyone says, is hard in so many ways because you don't have the inertia that carries you through, and you need to push uphill for a long time to make it work.
Right. So tactically, if you could start again and focus on distribution more, what would you do differently? Like, what tactically would you do? Is it more sort of content, more meetings, more trials? Is it just more spending more time on LinkedIn, or is it hiring like a salesperson early on, or a DevRel person early on?
Yeah. So sales is tough. I still do sales because I like it, and we talk to customers, and we've got like salespeople, sales advisors, and whatnot as well. But I still do sales. I don't know about hiring sales because, like, in my head, I'm like, oh, I need to talk to every customer to see if we're building the right thing. But I would 100% have, number one, partnered with Vercel earlier because we distribute via Vercel because we allow you to deploy events and queues and workflows and step functions to Vercel, so you don't need to change your infrastructure. I would have partnered with other folks like that a lot earlier because then it's kind of dual benefits. They can accept workloads and have systems running on their platforms that they wouldn't have been able to achieve without us. So mutually beneficial, a lot more content, a lot of videos, and a lot more talking in the industry about what we've done. Right. For sure. And it took us a while to sort of understand that because, again, it can be super alluring to work on the product, but that's not helpful 100% of the time.
Right. They say, especially if people don't know about it, it doesn't matter as much.
Yeah.
Getting the word out there is so important. Very important lesson to have learned. Tony, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think founders who are just getting off the ground are super impressed with what you and the team have been able to build. You and Dan specifically, and then really excited, obviously, to partner and then see what the future holds for Inngest. Hopefully, an amazing year and many, many years to come.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. We're particularly lucky to work with you as well. So thank you for the trust and the support early days. And thank you for the time. It's been great to chat with you. Yeah.
Of course.